Here is Sailor Kobe number 34 green tea. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This green is greatly affected by both pen and paper that you use. Kind of the reason that I do the reviews the way that I do. So yes, there is some color variation by pen, and in its lighter tones, it has some just okay shading that shows through. In its darker tones, it can get so dark it kind of is like a black green. Now, the mid-tone has a real refreshing feel to it that goes over very nicely. This ink didn't seem to perform very well on non-fountain pen friendly paper. Not a surprise, but it was very pronounced. It's an interesting green to use, without a doubt. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is
Cross Wanderlust. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the lightest tone that we're going to get with this ink. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading throughout. You see some nice darker areas when you put it back on the first line. The T of put is a bit darker than the rest of the word. It starts lighter, gets darker to the T. Back starts dark, gets light at the AC and dark at the K. Very nice, easy to read tone on this page, even though it is the lightest one we get with this ink. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, but that soft fine is a much drier pen. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. We get a solid, very dark black green, and I think it looks really good. It's not really the tone for me. However, I think if this is something that you like, this looks great on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine nib. There's no feathering and there is no spread. There is little bits of shading. I think the thicker line really kind of helped it come through. Look at Prisoners on the second line. You see the P starts darker. It lightens up at the R, dark at the IS, lighter at the ONER, dark at the S again. Even By is a nice light tone, where the is very dark. So you see a lot of the tones happening here with the medium nib. The shading seems to be coming through rather well here. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is a small spattering of shading. You get some darker letters like the I and while on the second line, or the comma after shout on the first line. Look at wandering on the second line, where the D is a bit darker than the N and E that surround it, and the G at the end does get darker, so it does show some nice spots of darker writing, which come through pretty well. I think it adds just a little bit, just a touch of shading in a nice way to the writing. Looking at the back of the page, without any kind of surprise, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 11 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. That drier nib really did help it out here without a doubt. There's a tiny bit of shading that does go on, like the S in first on the first line, the bottom of that T and part of that F. Look on the first line where it starts much lighter, gets much darker at that K. So the shading is even coming through on this non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. We do get some tiny feathers that are going on. Really a disappointment since this paper doesn't tend to often feather. The H in wet on the second line has a little bit of feathering. The I on the third line, a little bit of feathering. Not a lot. Lamented on the first line, a little bit of feathering. No real spread. No real shading. Pretty good, just not sure that this is what I'm going to want here. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker, a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We don't get feathering. We do get a tiny bit of spread when you look at them only side by side, this to the Clairfontaine. It's barely noticeable, to be honest. We do get a tiny bit of shading that comes through because we're getting some of the lighter tone. Pretty nice. In fact, the tone is closer to what we got with the broad on the Clairfontaine. I like what I'm seeing here with the medium nib on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium nib, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, still darker than it was with the soft fine on this paper. We get, well, minor feathering. I see it in 4 on the second line. I see it in the night on the third line. Very tiny, just kind of there. Little bit of spread happening. Not a normal thing for this paper, but it is there and disappointing. We have moments of shading, nowhere near as many as we did on the Clairfontaine. You see it with the P in help on the second line, the H in which on the first line, the T in night on the third. So it's definitely giving some. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, very minor ghosting. I think you could write on the back of this page if you wanted to. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker and kind of brighter. I know that seems weird. A little bit more of the green bright on this page than it was on the Clairfontaine. I think the tone of the paper is helping it out here. Now we get a tiny bit of feathering and a tiny bit of spread, and that's with the lines being so thin on the Clairfontaine that it's here, not that it's going to be a major issue. You see some of the feathering on it and the parenthesis on the first line. You see it on right on the second line. You see it on C in the third line. Everywhere you start to see it, it's a little bit darker. So yes, it does have some shading, like it on the first line, even he right next to that. The H, between the H and E, it lightens up a little bit. More on the second line is slightly darker on the M, lightens up in the OR, bit darker on the E. So we're getting all some nice features, and even when something negative's happening, like that little bit of feathering and a little bit of spread, it's not being a major problem. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was on or with the soft fine. It is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. You see it a little bit more as a green as a result of the tone of this paper. There still is a tiny little bit of feathering and a tiny little bit of spread that's happening, but not the worst in the world. Still, I think it's a usable situation here. We are seeing some shading. Look at shading. Look at especially on the second line and told directly underneath it on the third line, where told is quite a bit lighter than especially above it. Already to the left of told, the AL is darker than the REA and beginning of the D, where it gets darker at the DY. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine. It is showing more green than the Clairfontaine did, though it's just as dark. With it being a little bit lighter, we're going to get to see some shading. Now, for some reason here, I'm really not seeing any feathering. I see the tiniest bit of spread, tiniest bit of spread. The shading, I think, is pretty nice. It's kind of reminiscent of the shading that we got with the broad on the Clairfontaine. If you look at that on the first line, the first T is a little lighter than the hat that follows, nor underneath that is much lighter than the word, where heard right next to that starts very dark on the HEA. R and beginning of the D lighten up, and then the end of the D gets dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. I want to say a little bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine paper. Still have feathering, still have spread, have less shading coming through than we did on the Clairfontaine, though that's not really going to be a surprise, but there are some moments of it. I don't think the broad nib is the best choice on this paper because I'm looking, for instance, at the word dense, where the feathering and the spread on the D are a little distracting to me, and I don't think the shading is enough to really make up for what we see. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding. We get a little bit of show through, especially with that medium. Otherwise, really, I do think if you use a drier pen, you could write on the back of the page without a problem, because the writing of the soft fine, there's almost nothing back there. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get a little bit of shading, about as much shading as we had on the Clairfontaine. Look at cleared, first word, first line. The C starts lighter, the bottom of the L is dark, the EA is dark. Top of the A does lighten up a little bit. Then it gets a nice mid-tone through the rest of the word, where that on the second line, pretty dark. Webs underneath that, lighter. So for the most part, we're seeing whole words a little bit darker or a little bit lighter, opposed to the shading within the words. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is much darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, and we have no shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. It's just the same with thicker lines than it was with the wet fine. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet or with the medium. It is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, so darker than the soft fine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. I don't think the shading shows up as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, though we do get little bits like that on the second line, where the H is a little bit darker than the T and A that surround it. Creatures on the third line, mostly one tone, but the S at the end, a little bit darker. So the same little spattering of shading, just not as frequent. Looking at the back of the page, without any surprises, there's no bleeding and there's no ghosting. You could easily write on the back of this. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Colorverse Schrodinger. Here is Colorverse 39 Supernatural for the Opus 88 Picnic Green. Here is Cross Green. Here is Delta Green.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, which is a bit surprising because normally this paper makes inks look a little duller and flatter, but it looks the same. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading almost as well as we had it on the Clairfontaine, which makes this a very impressive choice on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. whole lot lighter. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading. I think the shading shows up a little bit nicer than it did with the soft fine here. Look at it on the first line. It starts lighter at the I, darkens at the T. They, almost underneath that, has a lighter T than H, and the H is darker than the E, lightens at the top of the Y, dark at the bottom of the Y. Whole lot of tone variation happening in one word. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading. This paper is doing especially well for showing off this ink. Yes, that shading is there, just a bit or more. Look at bit on the first line. The B is lighter, or the BI is lighter than the T where it gets dark, but look at hang'em too long on the second line. The H is a nice midtone, lightens up into the AN, darker at the G, where the EM goes lighter to darker. 2 is a light tone the whole way through, very uniform. Long starts light, gets darker as it progresses to the G. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, about the same tone as it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, still no feathering, still no spread, still getting some shading, not as much shading as we had on the Clairfontaine. Not a surprise, but it looks pretty good. Look at Killam, I say, on the first line. That L, the first L, is a bit darker on the kill. The M of EM, is a little bit darker than the E. Now, I, one tone, say, starts lighter, gets darker to and through the Y. Looking at the back of the page, you see how well this paper handles this ink with no bleeding, no ghosting, and easily using the back of the page. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's Summer Tanager. Here is Diatramentis Thomas Alva Edison Black Red. Here is Noodler's Black. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell India Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, we do get spread. Neither of those are really a surprise given the paper. I think they're usable on this paper with what I'm seeing. We are seeing some shading, which for copy paper is a scary thing. It makes me feel like there might be bleed spots, and we'll see that in a little bit. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread. We do not get shading. We get a fairly uniform tone. I think the feathering and the spread that's occurring would not make this really my favorite to use here. It's just no, but I guess if you had to, you could. Looking at the medium nib, it is about the same tone as it was with the wet fine nib, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, we do get spread, less than we had with the wet fine nib. I think it's fairly manageable here because this pen is more evenly flowed than that wet pen. The wet really wasn't helping it out at all. Shading, there's a couple of moments that are a bit darker, but for the most part, I would treat this like it's one tone on the page. Though if you wanted to look at dangling on the third line, it's a little bit darker than dwarvish on the fourth line, and even dangling has a few moments of shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, we have feathering. Yes, we have spread. Yes, it is more manageable than it was from the wet fine. No shading, nice green on the paper. I still think this looks better than it did with the wet fine because of the more even flow of the pen, having less feathering, just right a little bit bigger. looking at the back of the page, you see that it looks very deep into the page. There's a ton of show through that's happening, but nothing bled through, nothing touched the page underneath, which does give this some bonus points. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine was the lightest tone. That is still easy to read, and it has some shading. Now, the wet fine and the medium both looked generally the same on their respective papers, being very dark with generally little shading. The broad was a nice mid-tone with a spattering of shading throughout. So for me, I would prefer the tone with the spattering of shading from that medium flow broad nib. Now, if I had to choose what I would really want to avoid for myself, it would be a wet pen. That darker tone just doesn't appeal to me. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.